The year is 1844, and something impossible is unfolding at a slave auction in the American South. Buyers gather with coins in their pockets and cruelty in their eyes, expecting the usual spectacle: men forced to flex their muscles, women inspected like livestock, children ordered to speak their names. But today, something is wrong. Not a single person on the auction block says a word. The auctioneer shouts, the overseers threaten, the buyers grow impatient. Yet the people on the platform remain perfectly still, perfectly silent. What begins as confusion slowly turns into panic, because in that terrifying silence lies a weapon no one expected, one powerful enough to shatter the entire market. Tonight, we uncover the chilling story of the silent auction of 1844, where collective silence became an act of rebellion that terrified slave masters and shook the very economics of human bondage. Before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops of the town, the square where the auction block stood was already beginning to stir with movement. A thin layer of morning fog clung to the wooden buildings, and the damp earth carried the scent of mud, tobacco, and horse leather. Wagons creaked slowly along the narrow streets, their wheels groaning under heavy loads, while merchants unlocked their stalls and plantation owners gathered in small clusters, speaking in low, confident voices. For them, this was simply another ordinary day in the machinery of commerce. But at the center of the square stood a structure that reminded everyone exactly what kind of commerce it was. The auction block, a rough platform of thick wooden planks, rose only a few feet above the ground, yet it held the weight of countless lives. Its surface was scarred from years of boots, chains, and restless pacing. To the buyers assembling around it, the block represented opportunity, profit, and expansion. To the people who would soon be forced to stand upon it, it represented something else entirely: the moment their humanity would be measured, judged, and sold. Before we move deeper into this story, take a moment to join the conversation. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you, and don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Here on the Black Timeline, we uncover the hidden corners of history, stories that reveal how courage, resistance, and survival shaped the world we live in today. And the story you're about to hear is one of those moments. A moment that began quietly on a morning in 1844, when something unexpected happened at a slave auction, something so simple yet so powerful that it would ripple through the marketplace like a shockwave. As the town slowly awakened, the square began to fill with people whose intentions were painfully clear. Plantation owners arrived on horseback, their coats pressed and their boots polished, carrying ledgers filled with numbers and plans for expanding their estates. Slave traders stood near the platform with the confidence of men who believed they controlled the outcome of every transaction. Their voices were loud, their laughter careless, their movements practiced. They had done this hundreds of times before. Auctions followed a predictable rhythm. The captives were brought forward, the buyers examined them, the auctioneer shouted his rapid-fire bids, and the hammer came down. It was a brutal routine, but it was routine nonetheless. Every participant in the market knew their role, but there were others in the square who did not arrive freely. Behind the auction block, in a fenced holding area partially hidden from the main crowd, a group of men, women, and children stood together under the watchful eyes of armed overseers. Iron shackles linked some of their ankles, others had ropes binding their wrists. Their clothes were worn from travel, their faces marked by exhaustion. Many of them had been transported long distances, separated from families and communities they might never see again. For some, the journey to this town had taken weeks. For others, it had taken months. And now they stood only a few yards away from the platform, where their futures would be decided by strangers. The overseers paced slowly along the fence line, their boots crunching against gravel as they kept watch. Every movement of the captives was monitored. Any whisper that grew too loud was quickly silenced by a glare or the threatening snap of a whip in the air. To the traders, these people were not individuals with memories, dreams, or identities. They were merchandise awaiting display, inventory waiting to be inspected, numbers waiting to be written into someone else's ledger. The captives understood what was coming. Many of them had seen auctions before. They knew the humiliating rituals that would soon unfold. Men would be forced to flex their muscles, lift heavy objects, or run across the platform to prove their strength. Women would be inspected with cold clinical scrutiny, teeth examined, arms squeezed, skin prodded. Buyers would ask invasive questions about age, health, endurance, obedience. Each answer would raise or lower the price attached to their lives. But on this particular morning, something unusual hung in the air among the captives gathered behind the block. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. To an outsider, it might have looked like nothing at all. Yet beneath the stillness there was a quiet awareness moving between them, a shared understanding that had formed sometime during the long hours of the previous night. The night before the auction had been tense and restless. The captives had been held together in a cramped enclosure behind the trading yard, where the wooden walls muffled the sounds of the town beyond. A single lantern flickered overhead, casting shadows across tired faces. Sleep came only in fragments. Some people stared silently at the floor, lost in thoughts of the families they had been torn away from. Others whispered prayers under their breath. Every so often the clank of chains or the shuffle of feet broke the quiet. It was during those hours of darkness that the idea began to move through the group. No one knows exactly who spoke the first words. History rarely records the origin of such moments. Perhaps it was a man who had endured multiple auctions and understood how the system worked. Perhaps it was a woman who had watched too many people humiliated on the platform and realized that the entire process depended on forced participation. Or perhaps it was simply a thought that several people reached at the same time. The realization was deceptively simple. The auction only worked if the captives cooperated, if they answered questions, demonstrated strength, spoke their names, and obeyed the commands shouted by the auctioneer. The buyers could evaluate them like livestock and determine their price. But if those actions stopped, if the captives refused to play their assigned roles, the machinery of the marketplace might grind to a halt. At first the idea sounded impossible. Defiance at a slave auction was dangerous. Punishments could be severe and immediate. Whippings, isolation, even death were real possibilities. The overseers carried weapons and authority. They expected obedience and they enforced it brutally. Yet the thought lingered. One person whispered the possibility to another. What if we refuse? What if none of us speak? What if the buyers cannot judge us? The whispers traveled slowly through the group. Not everyone spoke, but many listened. And in the silence that followed those quiet exchanges, something remarkable began to take shape. It was not a formal agreement. There were no leaders issuing commands, no speeches rallying the group. Instead, there was a silent recognition spreading from person to person. If they stood together in stillness, the buyers would lose control of the process. Morning eventually arrived, and with it came the footsteps of the overseers unlocking the holding area. Chains were checked, ropes tightened, and the captives were lined up to be brought toward the auction block. The traders expected nervousness, fear, perhaps even pleading. Those reactions were common and predictable. What they did not expect was the calm. As the captives stepped into the open square, the rising sun illuminated rows of faces that were quiet but steady. Some eyes looked toward the platform, others stared straight ahead. No one shouted, no one cried out. The silence was heavy but deliberate. The crowd of buyers barely noticed at first. Their attention was focused on business matters, discussing crop prices, comparing notes about recent auctions in neighboring towns, calculating how many laborers they needed for the coming harvest season. To them, the captives were simply the next set of assets arriving on schedule. The auctioneer himself stood near the platform preparing for the morning's work. He was a man known for his booming voice and rapid-fire chant, a performer as much as a salesman. His job required confidence and control. The faster the bids rose, the higher the profits climbed. He had spent years perfecting the rhythm of the auction call, turning the sale of human lives into a spectacle designed to excite competition among buyers. He glanced briefly at the captives being brought forward and nodded to the traders. Everything appeared normal. The platform was ready, the crowd was ready, the buyers were ready. But what none of them realized, what none of them could yet see, was that the people standing near that platform had already made a decision. They would not speak, they would not perform, they would not participate in the ritual that turned their lives into commodities. Instead, they would step onto that wooden stage and give the marketplace something it had never encountered before: absolute, unbreakable silence, and within that silence lay a quiet form of rebellion powerful enough to shake the confidence of every trader, buyer, and auctioneer in the square. Because sometimes the most dangerous act in a system built on forced obedience is simply refusing to obey. As the first light of morning strengthened and the fog slowly lifted from the square, the true machinery of the marketplace began to reveal itself. The auction block was no longer just a wooden platform in the center of town. It had become the stage for a carefully orchestrated system designed to transform human lives into economic assets. By the year 1844, slave auctions across parts of the American South had evolved into highly structured marketplaces, where the buying and selling of people followed procedures that were disturbingly precise. Every movement, every inspection, every shouted bid was part of a process that reduced human beings to entries in ledgers. Plantation owners, traders, and speculators approached the platform not with empathy, but with calculation. They studied bodies the way merchants studied cattle or tools, measuring strength, endurance, and obedience in terms of how much profit those qualities might produce in the fields. The buyers gathering in the square that morning were not reckless men acting on impulse. They were investors making decisions they believed were logical. Cotton production was expanding rapidly during this period, and with it came a growing demand for labor. The economic engine driving the region depended heavily on plantations that required large workforces to plant, harvest, and process crops. Enslaved people were therefore treated as capital investments, assets expected to generate years of productivity. A healthy young man might be purchased for his ability to endure long days under the sun, lifting heavy loads and cultivating fields. A skilled craftsman could command a higher price because his labor carried specialized value. Even children were evaluated for the potential they represented as future workers. In this grim arithmetic, humanity was erased and replaced with market logic. The traders who managed these auctions understood the psychology of their buyers very well. They knew that plantation owners needed reassurance before committing their money. The buyers had to believe that the individual standing on the block was strong, obedient, and capable of enduring the brutal demands of plantation labor. That reassurance did not come from paperwork or promises. It came from demonstration. The captives were forced to perform physical tests in front of the crowd so that their bodies could be evaluated as if they were machinery being inspected before purchase. It was a ritual of humiliation designed to convince buyers that they were making safe investments. The process usually began the same way each time. A captive would be brought forward and positioned at the center of the platform. The auctioneer would announce basic details, age, gender, and any skills the traders claimed the person possessed. Then came the demonstrations. Men were ordered to stretch their arms, flex their muscles, and sometimes lift heavy objects placed on the platform. Buyers would watch carefully, whispering to one another as they assessed posture, stamina, and overall condition. Some demanded that the person run or walk across the platform to prove that their legs were strong and uninjured. Others would climb onto the block themselves to examine the captive more closely, squeezing arms or inspecting shoulders like mechanics testing the strength of a machine. The inspections could become deeply invasive. Buyers frequently demanded that mouths be opened so they could examine teeth, believing that dental condition revealed clues about age and health. Hands were studied for calluses that suggested experience in fieldwork. Skin was checked for scars or injuries that might reduce productivity. These examinations took place in front of crowds who watched with casual interest, as if witnessing a routine business transaction. What should have been private aspects of human dignity were instead treated as features of merchandise. Women faced their own set of degrading inspections. Buyers evaluated them not only for their ability to work, but also for their potential to bear children who would themselves become enslaved laborers. Their strength, health, and age were scrutinized with unsettling attention. Traders often exaggerated qualities they believed would attract higher bids, praising endurance or fertility as though they were advertising livestock. The language used during these auctions rarely acknowledged the individuals standing on the platform as people with histories or identities. Instead, the vocabulary of commerce dominated every interaction: prime field hand, good breeding stock, strong worker, reliable labor. Each phrase reinforced the idea that human lives could be categorized, priced, and exchanged like goods. The auctioneer played a crucial role in maintaining the momentum of this system. His voice controlled the rhythm of the marketplace. With practiced skill, he would shout bids in rapid succession, creating a sense of urgency that pushed buyers to compete with one another. The faster the bids climbed, the greater the profits for traders and the more excitement rippled through the crowd. Auctioneers were performers as much as salesmen, using humor, exaggeration, and relentless energy to keep the process moving. The spectacle itself was designed to drown out any discomfort buyers might feel about the cruelty of the situation. When the bidding reached its peak and the hammer finally fell, applause or laughter often followed, as if the sale had been nothing more than a successful business deal. Yet beneath the surface of this ritualized marketplace lay a fragile dependency, one that few traders ever acknowledged. The entire system required the participation of the captives themselves. Without demonstrations of strength, without answers to the auctioneer's questions, without visible proof of obedience, the buyers had far less information upon which to base their decisions. Plantation owners were cautious investors. Purchasing enslaved laborers involved large sums of money, and buyers wanted evidence that their investment would be reliable. The humiliating displays forced upon the captives served exactly that purpose. They reassured buyers that the individuals they were purchasing would comply with commands and perform labor without resistance. Because of this dependency, the captives' cooperation, though coerced, became an invisible pillar supporting the entire structure of the auction. Traders assumed obedience would always be present. The overseers standing near the platform carried whips and weapons precisely to ensure that compliance remained unquestioned. Fear was meant to guarantee participation. The possibility that captives might collectively refuse the process rarely entered the minds of those running the marketplace. But on this morning in 1844, something subtle had shifted before the first bid had even been called. As the captives waited near the platform, the buyers began gathering closer, forming a loose semicircle around the block. Their conversations drifted across the square, discussions about crop yields, shipping schedules, and the rising demand for cotton in distant factories. The economic forces driving their decisions stretched far beyond the boundaries of the town. Textile mills in Europe and the northern United States relied heavily on southern cotton, and that demand created immense pressure for plantations to expand production. Every additional acre planted meant more labor was required to harvest it. The buyers in the square believed they were participants in a vast economic network that stretched across oceans and continents. To them, the captives standing only a few yards away were simply the next supply of labor feeding that network. Traders moved among the buyers, offering brief descriptions of the people who would soon appear on the block. Their sales pitches were confident and rehearsed. They spoke of strength, youth, resilience, qualities designed to excite interest before the auction even began. Some buyers nodded approvingly, already calculating how much they might be willing to bid. Others remained silent, studying the captives with cautious eyes, as they tried to guess which individuals might offer the greatest return on investment. The overseers guarding the captives noticed nothing unusual in the stillness among them. Silence was not uncommon before an auction. Fear often left people speechless. But the quiet in this group was different. It was not the silence of helplessness. It was deliberate, steady, and shared. Each person standing there carried the same unspoken understanding from the night before. The system worked because they were forced to participate in it, and if they stopped participating, the buyers might not know what to do. The idea itself was simple, yet its implications were profound. If every captive refused to answer questions, refused to demonstrate strength, and refused to respond to commands, the auctioneer's performance would collapse. Without cooperation, the carefully choreographed ritual of inspection and bidding would falter. Buyers would lose the information they relied on to determine value. Doubt would creep into their calculations, and doubt, in a marketplace driven by profit, could be dangerous. But carrying out such a plan required remarkable courage. Each individual standing near the platform knew the risks involved. Overseers were watching closely, and punishments for defiance could be severe. Even so, the quiet determination among them did not waver. They had already endured the loss of freedom, the separation from loved ones, the long journey to the auction yard. Compared to those hardships, the act of refusing to speak, of standing still and withholding cooperation, became a powerful statement of resistance. As the square grew more crowded and the auctioneer prepared to climb onto the platform, the captives slowly formed a line. Chains clinked softly as they shifted their weight. A few buyers glanced toward them with casual curiosity, still unaware that the morning's events would not follow the familiar script they expected. The auctioneer adjusted his coat, stepped onto the wooden block, and surveyed the gathering crowd. His confident expression suggested that another profitable day was about to begin. Traders moved to the edges of the platform, ready to bring forward the first person for inspection. The buyers leaned slightly closer, anticipating the usual spectacle of demonstrations and bidding, yet the captives remained motionless. They did not whisper, they did not plead, they did not look at one another for reassurance. Instead, they faced forward in a calm, unyielding stillness that none of the traders seemed to notice, at least not yet. Within moments, the first command would be shouted across the square. The familiar ritual would begin. But when the auctioneer called for the first captive to speak, the marketplace was about to encounter something it had never seen before: absolute silence. The stillness that had settled among the captives that morning did not appear suddenly or without cause. It had grown slowly in the shadows of the previous night, in the cramped darkness behind the auction yard where they had been kept together before the sale. The holding enclosure was little more than a rough wooden structure with narrow slats that allowed thin lines of moonlight to filter through. The air inside was heavy with exhaustion and quiet despair. Chains clinked softly whenever someone shifted position, and the faint sounds of the town drifting in from outside, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of wagon wheels, the muffled laughter from a nearby tavern, felt strangely distant from the tense silence within the enclosure. Sleep came only in fragments. Many of the captives sat awake with their backs against the walls, staring into the dim light of a lantern that swung slightly from a beam overhead. The knowledge of what awaited them in the morning weighed heavily on every mind. By this point, most of them understood the brutal mechanics of a slave auction. They knew the humiliations that would unfold once the sun rose, the commands that would be shouted, the inspections that would follow, and the moment when strangers would decide their worth with a wave of money and the strike of a hammer. Some of the captives had been through auctions before. They had already experienced the unsettling sensation of standing on a platform while strangers debated their value as if discussing tools or livestock. Those who had witnessed it knew how the process unfolded step by step. The trader's introduction, the auctioneer's booming voice, the demand to speak, the orders to move, the scrutiny of every muscle and bone. Buyers expected the captives to respond quickly and obediently, because obedience itself was considered evidence of a good investment. The ritual was designed to extract demonstrations of compliance in front of the crowd. Anyone who hesitated risked punishment, yet those demonstrations also made the captives easier to evaluate, easier to price, easier to sell. But as the lantern flickered that night, and the hours stretched slowly toward dawn, a different kind of conversation began to take shape in the enclosure. It started quietly, almost cautiously, as if the idea itself were too dangerous to speak aloud at first. A whisper passed between two people sitting near the wall. Another voice joined in, barely louder than a breath. Someone shifted closer, straining to hear. The overseers outside the enclosure paced back and forth, their boots scraping against the dirt, but they paid little attention to the murmured exchanges within. Whispers among captives were common. Traders assumed that fear and uncertainty produced quiet conversations about families left behind or worries about what might happen next. Yet this conversation was different. Instead of dwelling on despair, it began to explore a possibility, one that seemed almost unthinkable at first. The realization had emerged from a simple observation: the auction depended on performance. The captives were expected to speak their names, answer questions, display strength, and obey commands. Those actions gave buyers the information they needed to decide how much money to offer. Without that cooperation, the auctioneer's routine would become far more difficult. Buyers would have less evidence upon which to base their decisions. Doubt would creep into the process. Someone whispered the question that changed the entire atmosphere inside the enclosure: what if we refuse? At first, the idea hung in the air like a fragile spark. Refusal carried enormous risks. Overseers were never far away, and the punishments for defiance could be immediate and brutal. Even suggesting resistance felt dangerous. Yet the thought lingered, refusing to disappear. Another voice responded cautiously, almost testing the boundaries of the idea. Refuse? How? The answer came in the simplest form imaginable: say nothing. No shouting, no fighting, no dramatic confrontation, just silence. The idea seemed almost too small to matter, yet the more it was considered, the more powerful it appeared. If one person alone refused to speak during the auction, the overseers would likely respond quickly with threats or violence. But if everyone on the platform refused at the same time, if every captive withheld their voice, their demonstrations, their cooperation, the situation might become far more complicated. The traders would struggle to force so many people to perform simultaneously under the eyes of the buyers. The auctioneer's rhythm would break. The buyers would hesitate. The whispers moved slowly from one group of captives to another. Some people listened in silence, weighing the danger of such an act. Others nodded faintly, recognizing the logic behind the idea. There was no formal meeting, no leader giving instructions. The plan spread through shared understanding rather than commands. Each person who heard the proposal had to decide individually whether they were willing to participate. The risks were real, and everyone understood them. Refusing to obey orders could provoke harsh punishment. Overseers might attempt to force compliance through intimidation or violence. Some captives feared that others might break under pressure, leaving the rest exposed to retaliation. Trust was difficult in such circumstances, especially among people who had only recently been brought together from different places and backgrounds. Yet something remarkable began to happen as the night continued. One by one, people started to accept the idea. The reason was not simply courage, it was clarity. The captives recognized that they had almost no control over the situation surrounding them. The traders held the chains. The overseers carried weapons. The buyers possessed the money that would determine their fate. But there was one thing that the system could not easily seize: their participation. Speech itself became a kind of currency in the auction process. When the captives answered questions, demonstrated strength, and obeyed commands, they contributed to the market's ability to evaluate them. Their cooperation, forced though it was, made the auction function smoothly. If that cooperation disappeared, the entire performance could unravel. In the dim lantern light, the captives began to understand that silence could become a weapon. It would not stop the system entirely. The traders still possessed power and authority. But silence could disrupt the smooth flow of the marketplace, and disruption might create uncertainty. Uncertainty might lead buyers to hesitate, and hesitation in a market driven by profit could weaken the traders' control over the process. As the idea spread through the enclosure, the whispers gradually faded into a quiet but unmistakable agreement. No one spoke loudly, no one declared the plan openly. Instead, the decision passed silently from person to person through brief nods, steady glances, and the calm understanding that formed between strangers facing the same fate. The lantern eventually burned low, casting longer shadows across the walls. Outside, the sounds of the town grew quieter as night deepened. Some captives leaned back against the wooden boards and closed their eyes, though sleep remained restless and shallow. Others sat awake, replaying the idea in their minds. Would it work? Would everyone remain silent when the moment came? Would fear break the fragile unity that had formed among them? No one could answer those questions yet, but by the time the first pale hints of dawn appeared through the slats in the walls, the decision had already taken root. When the overseers opened the enclosure and ordered the captives to stand, the quiet determination remained intact. Chains were checked, ropes tightened, and the group was led out toward the square where the auction block awaited. The traders assumed the subdued expressions on the captives' faces reflected exhaustion or fear. They did not realize that something far more deliberate lay beneath that calm exterior. As the captives stepped into the morning air, the square around them was already filling with buyers. The platform stood at the center, its weathered boards ready for another day of transactions. Merchants talked among themselves. Plantation owners adjusted their coats and examined their ledgers. The auctioneer prepared his voice for the rapid chant that would soon echo across the crowd. Everything appeared normal, yet beneath the routine preparations of the marketplace, an invisible tension had begun to build. Each captive standing near the platform carried the same silent promise formed during the long hours of the previous night. They would not answer questions. They would not demonstrate strength. They would not participate in the ritual that turned their bodies into commodities. Instead, they would step onto the auction block and offer the marketplace something it had never been forced to confront before: collective stillness. And as the auctioneer raised his voice to begin the day's proceedings, the fragile yet powerful plan born in whispers was about to face its first test, because within moments, The system that depended on obedience would issue its first command, and the captives, bound by chains yet united by silence, would have to decide whether their quiet act of defiance could truly withstand the pressure of the marketplace. As the murmurs of the crowd swelled across the square, the moment that everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The auctioneer stepped forward and climbed onto the wooden platform with the practiced confidence of a man who believed he controlled the rhythm of the entire marketplace. His boots struck the planks with a sharp echo, and the sound alone seemed to command attention. Conversations among the buyers gradually faded as heads turned toward the platform. This was the beginning of the ritual they all knew so well, the performance that would transform the quiet group of captives standing nearby into items of commerce. The auctioneer adjusted his coat, cleared his throat, and surveyed the gathering crowd with a sweeping glance that carried both authority and expectation. Around the block, plantation owners tightened their grip on their ledgers, traders leaned closer to the platform, and speculators stepped forward to secure a better view. Everything about the moment suggested that another ordinary auction was about to begin. The captives were brought forward in a slow line under the watchful eyes of the overseers. Chains rattled softly with each step, and the dust beneath their feet shifted as they moved closer to the platform. For the buyers, this part of the process had a familiar rhythm. They watched the captives approach the block with a kind of detached curiosity, scanning faces and bodies with the calculating expressions of men evaluating merchandise. Some whispered quietly to their neighbors, making early guesses about which individuals might attract higher bids. Others simply waited, confident that the demonstrations would soon reveal everything they needed to know. The marketplace had operated this way countless times before. There was no reason to believe that today would be any different. Yet the captives approaching the platform carried within them the quiet determination formed during the long hours of the previous night. Their faces remained calm, their posture steady. They did not look at the crowd of buyers circling the block. Instead, many of them fixed their gaze forward or slightly downward, focusing on maintaining the stillness that had become their shared agreement. Each step toward the platform felt heavy with meaning. Once they stood upon the block, the true test would begin. The auctioneer would issue his commands, the buyers would expect demonstrations, and the overseers would be watching for any sign of hesitation. It was one thing to whisper a plan in the safety of darkness. It was another thing entirely to carry it out under the bright light of morning, with the eyes of the entire marketplace fixed upon them. The auctioneer raised his hand slightly, signaling for the traders to bring the first person forward. A man was guided onto the platform and positioned near the center of the wooden boards. The crowd leaned in with mild interest. The auctioneer's voice rang out across the square, loud and clear, the way it had on countless other mornings. He began with the familiar introduction, describing the captive's age and supposed abilities in the exaggerated language of a salesman eager to spark competition. His words flowed quickly, almost rhythmically, as he prepared to launch into the rapid chant that would drive the bidding higher. Then came the first command, "State your name." The order echoed across the square and settled into the air like a challenge. The man on the platform did not move. He did not look toward the auctioneer. He did not glance at the crowd. He simply stood there. At first, the silence seemed unremarkable. Auctions often began with a brief pause while captives gathered their courage to speak. Buyers shifted slightly, assuming the man might simply be nervous. The auctioneer waited a moment, expecting the response that usually followed such commands, but no answer came. The auctioneer frowned slightly and repeated the order, his voice sharper this time. "Your name. Speak up so the buyers can hear you." Still nothing. The man remained motionless, his expression calm, his lips closed. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Buyers glanced at one another with raised eyebrows. Some chuckled quietly, assuming the captive was frightened or stubborn. The auctioneer, however, was not amused. His entire performance relied on maintaining control over the platform, and any hesitation threatened to disrupt the pace of the sale. He stepped closer to the man and spoke again, this time with a tone that carried a hint of warning. "I said, tell the crowd your name." The square fell unusually quiet as everyone waited for the response, but the response never came. The man's silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Seconds passed. The auctioneer's expression hardened as he realized that the hesitation was not the result of fear or confusion. The captive was refusing to cooperate. Such defiance was rare, but it was not entirely unheard of. Sometimes a captive would resist in small ways, speaking too softly, answering slowly, or hesitating during demonstrations. Usually, a sharp command or the crack of a whip nearby was enough to restore compliance. The auctioneer turned briefly toward one of the overseers standing near the platform, as if expecting him to intervene. The overseer stepped forward slightly, his hand resting on the handle of his whip. But before he could act, the auctioneer tried another approach. Maintaining the appearance of control was important in front of the buyers. If the situation could be resolved without violence, the auction might continue smoothly. The auctioneer forced a thin smile and addressed the crowd with a hint of humor. "Seems this one's shy today," he said loudly, "but strength speaks louder than words." He gestured toward the man and issued a new command. "Show the buyers what you can do. Lift your arms." Once again the platform became perfectly still. The man did not move. The silence returned, heavier than before. This time the confusion among the buyers deepened. A few men shifted their stance, their earlier amusement fading into curiosity. The auctioneer's performance depended on cooperation, and without it, the usual flow of the sale had already begun to falter. He turned toward the traders standing near the edge of the platform and gestured impatiently. "Bring the next one forward," he snapped. Perhaps the first man was unusually stubborn. The second captive might restore the rhythm of the auction. A young woman was guided onto the block and positioned beside the first man. The buyers studied her with interest as the auctioneer launched once more into his practiced introduction, describing her supposed qualities with confident exaggeration. When he finished, he turned toward her and delivered the familiar instruction. "State your name." Silence. The woman remained still, her eyes fixed forward. A murmur spread through the crowd. The auctioneer's patience began to thin. He repeated the command more forcefully. "Speak." The woman did not respond. Now the murmurs grew louder. Buyers began whispering to one another, puzzled by the unusual behavior unfolding before them. Two captives had been commanded to speak, and both had refused. The coincidence was too strange to ignore. The auctioneer's voice rose again, sharp and demanding. "Show the buyers your teeth." The woman did not move. He turned abruptly toward the first man. "You, raise your arms." Nothing. The platform had become a stage of perfect stillness. What had begun as a minor disruption was now transforming into something far more unsettling. The auctioneer glanced toward the line of captives, waiting near the edge of the block, hoping that the next person might break the strange pattern. If even one of them obeyed, the situation might still be salvaged. Another captive was pushed forward. The command came again. "Speak your name." Silence. The crowd's whispers grew louder, spreading through the square like ripples across water. Buyers who had arrived expecting a routine sale now found themselves witnessing something they had never seen before. The auctioneer's voice, once booming with confidence, began to carry a hint of frustration. He barked another order. "Show your strength." The captive remained motionless. The pattern repeated again and again. Each command was met with the same response, absolute silence. The auctioneer's rapid-fire chant had vanished entirely. Instead of the familiar rhythm of bidding and demonstrations, the square had become eerily quiet. Buyers shifted uneasily, uncertain how to react. Without the usual displays of strength and obedience, they had no way to judge the value of the captives before them. The traders standing nearby began exchanging anxious glances. Something was very wrong. And as the silence on the platform stretched longer with each passing moment, the entire marketplace began to feel the unsettling weight of a realization that none of them had anticipated. The captives were not merely hesitant, they were united, and the auction, built on obedience, performance, and control, was beginning to unravel before their eyes. The silence on the auction block lingered in a way that felt unnatural, almost unsettling, as though the square itself had momentarily forgotten how to breathe. Only minutes earlier the marketplace had been full of casual chatter and confident calculations, the usual rhythm of a slave auction preparing to begin. Now that rhythm had collapsed. Buyers who had arrived expecting the familiar spectacle of demonstrations and bidding found themselves staring at a platform where nothing seemed to move. The captives stood in calm, unyielding stillness, their refusal to speak hanging in the air like an invisible barrier between them and the men who had come to purchase them. For the first time that morning, uncertainty began to ripple through the crowd. At first, many of the buyers assumed the disruption was temporary. Perhaps the captives were frightened. Perhaps they had not heard the commands clearly. Some chuckled quietly, leaning toward one another with amused expressions, as if they were watching a brief inconvenience that would soon be corrected. Slave auctions, after all, were rarely halted by hesitation. Overseers carried whips and authority precisely to ensure that obedience would follow quickly after any resistance, but the seconds continued to stretch. The auctioneer stood at the center of the platform, his expression tightening as the silence persisted. His reputation depended on his ability to control the pace of an auction, to keep the crowd engaged and the bids rising. The longer the platform remained quiet, the more his authority appeared to weaken. He cleared his throat again and raised his voice with renewed force. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Speak when you're told." His command echoed sharply across the square, but it produced no reaction from the captives standing before him. Their stillness seemed almost deliberate now, as if each person on the platform had chosen to become a statue carved from the same quiet determination. They did not glance at the auctioneer. They did not acknowledge the buyers staring up at them. They simply remained silent. The murmurs among the crowd began to grow louder. Several buyers shifted their stance and stepped closer to the platform, hoping to study the captives more carefully. Without demonstrations of strength or answers to questions, they had little information upon which to base their decisions. Plantation owners were accustomed to evaluating potential laborers through observation and inspection. They expected to see muscles flexed, teeth examined, and posture tested. But the captives had removed themselves from that process entirely. One buyer leaned toward another and spoke quietly, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "Something's wrong here." Another man nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the motionless figures on the block. "They won't answer him." The auctioneer's frustration deepened as the whispers spread through the crowd. He turned toward one of the overseers standing nearby and gave a quick, impatient gesture. The overseer stepped forward, the leather whip in his hand coiled tightly, its presence a silent reminder of the authority backing the marketplace. The buyers watched with renewed interest. In their experience, resistance rarely lasted long once overseers intervened. The overseer cracked the whip sharply against the wooden edge of the platform, not striking anyone, but making a sound loud enough to snap through the square like thunder. The crack echoed between the buildings, causing several people in the crowd to flinch. Still, the captives did not move. The man standing at the center of the platform remained exactly where he was, his gaze steady, his silence intact. The woman beside him held the same calm posture. One by one, the other captives waiting to be called forward displayed the same unyielding stillness. The overseer's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected the sound of the whip to provoke fear, perhaps even immediate compliance. Instead, he found himself facing a line of people who seemed strangely unmoved by the threat. The auctioneer tried again, raising his voice in a booming command meant to reassert control. "Show the buyers you're strong," he shouted toward one of the men. "Lift your arms." Nothing. The command seemed to vanish into the silence surrounding the platform. Now the murmurs among the buyers began to carry a different tone. The earlier amusement had faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Investors depended on reliable information before spending large sums of money. Without the usual demonstrations, the captive's physical condition and willingness to work remained uncertain. One buyer folded his arms and spoke aloud, no longer bothering to keep his voice low. "How do we know what we're buying if they won't even speak?" Another responded with a skeptical shake of his head. "If they're this stubborn here, what will they be like in the fields?" The questions drifted across the crowd, reinforcing the doubt that had begun to take root. The traders standing near the edge of the platform could feel the shift in atmosphere immediately. Their profits depended on convincing buyers that the captives were dependable laborers, but the silence on the platform was making that argument increasingly difficult to sustain. The auctioneer tried to restore the familiar rhythm of the sale by forcing a new command into the air. "Walk across the platform," he ordered one of the men. The captive remained still. The auctioneer's face flushed slightly with anger. He pointed toward another person in the line. "You, step forward and speak." Silence. Each command that failed only deepened the tension. Buyers began stepping back from the platform rather than closer to it. Their interest was fading, replaced by cautious calculation. Investing in enslaved laborers required confidence in their ability to work under strict supervision, yet the captives' collective refusal to cooperate was creating an image of unpredictability. One trader leaned toward the auctioneer and whispered something urgently, perhaps suggesting a way to break the stalemate. The auctioneer nodded impatiently and turned back to the crowd. "These people are strong workers," he insisted loudly, attempting to salvage the situation. "They've been traveling for days, a bit tired, that's all." But the explanation sounded weak, even to his own ears. Buyers were not convinced by words alone. They needed proof, and the captives were giving them none. As the minutes passed, the silence began to feel less like a momentary disruption and more like a deliberate act of defiance. The captives were not hesitating individually, they were acting together. Each person who refused to speak strengthened the resolve of the others. The platform had become a stage for a form of resistance that the marketplace had never been designed to handle. The overseers tried again to provoke a reaction. Another whip crack echoed across the square. A sharp command was barked toward the line of captives waiting below the platform. "Move!" No one responded. The buyers watched the scene with growing discomfort. The longer the stalemate continued, the more it threatened the logic of the entire marketplace. Slave auctions relied on a carefully balanced performance. Traders presented the captives as obedient workers, auctioneers encouraged competitive bidding, and buyers evaluated the merchandise with confidence. But that balance had collapsed. Without cooperation, the auctioneer's voice had lost its authority. Without demonstrations, the buyers had lost their certainty. Without certainty, the bids would never begin. One plantation owner who had arrived early in the morning now closed his ledger with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked toward the platform with clear skepticism. "I'm not buying trouble," he muttered to the man beside him. Another buyer nodded in agreement. "If they refuse orders here, they'll refuse orders anywhere." Their words spread quietly through the crowd, reinforcing the doubt that had already begun to dominate the square. Traders shifted uneasily, realizing that the captive's silence had begun to infect the buyer's confidence. The auctioneer attempted once more to reclaim control. His voice rose louder than ever before, echoing across the entire square. "Last chance," he shouted toward the captives. "Speak!" But the platform remained perfectly still. In that moment, something profound became clear to everyone watching. The captives were not simply resisting, they were united, and the marketplace, built on the assumption that obedience could always be forced, had suddenly encountered a force it had never prepared for: collective defiance. The crowd fell into an uneasy hush as the reality of the situation settled over the square. Buyers exchanged skeptical glances. Traders whispered urgently among themselves. Overseers gripped their whips tighter, unsure how to restore order without creating a spectacle that might scare off the remaining investors. What had begun as a routine morning sale was now teetering on the edge of collapse, and the captives standing on the block, silent, still, and unwavering, had become the center of a quiet rebellion that was beginning to unravel the entire marketplace. The silence that settled over the square had now transformed into something far heavier than simple hesitation. It pressed down on the marketplace like an invisible weight, suffocating the confidence that had filled the air only an hour earlier. The captives remained standing on the auction block in the same unwavering stillness, their refusal to move or speak now unmistakably deliberate. For the traders and overseers who had spent years managing auctions, the situation had crossed from inconvenience into something far more troubling. What they were witnessing was not individual resistance, it was coordinated defiance. And that realization began to ripple through the crowd like a slow, creeping wave. The auctioneer, who had once commanded the square with a booming voice and effortless authority, now stood in a rare position of uncertainty. His usual rhythm had been completely shattered. Normally, the chant of bids would be echoing across the crowd by this point, numbers rising rapidly as buyers competed with one another. Instead, the only sounds were the low murmurs of uneasy conversation and the occasional restless shuffle of boots against the dirt. The auctioneer wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead and tried once again to regain control of the situation. "You there," he barked, pointing at one of the men standing near the center of the platform. "Step forward and show the buyers your strength." The command hung in the air. The man did not move. The stillness of his body seemed almost unnatural now, like the calm surface of water before a storm. His silence was not hesitant or fearful, it was firm, anchored by the quiet agreement that had formed among the captives during the night. Around him, the others held the same posture. No eyes shifted nervously toward the overseers, no voices broke the quiet. They simply stood. The overseers began pacing more aggressively near the edge of the platform, their boots grinding into the dust as they watched for any sign of weakness among the captives. Their presence was meant to radiate intimidation, to remind everyone watching that the authority of the traders was backed by violence. One of them stepped forward again and cracked his whip sharply against the wood of the platform. The sound split through the square like a gunshot, causing several buyers to flinch instinctively. Still nothing. The captives remained frozen in place. For the overseers, this moment was deeply unsettling. Their entire role within the system depended on the belief that fear would always produce obedience. Whips, threats, and punishment were tools designed to force compliance. But here, in the middle of a crowded marketplace, those tools seemed strangely ineffective. The captives were not shouting or fighting back, they were simply refusing to participate. And that quiet refusal was far more difficult to control. The buyers began to shift uneasily. Some folded their arms across their chests, while others rubbed their beards thoughtfully, studying the captives with narrowed eyes. Plantation owners were practical men who based their decisions on risk and profit. Without demonstrations of strength or willingness to obey commands, the captives on the platform appeared unpredictable. One buyer spoke aloud, his voice carrying across the tense crowd. "If they won't follow orders here, what makes you think they'll follow them in the fields?" Another buyer nodded in agreement. "A man who won't speak on the block might refuse to work on the plantation." The words spread quietly through the crowd, reinforcing the doubts already growing in the minds of the investors. Traders began whispering urgently among themselves, trying to determine how to salvage the situation before the buyers lost interest completely. Every passing minute without a sale meant lost profit. One trader climbed halfway onto the platform and spoke directly to one of the captives in a low, threatening tone. "You'd better answer when you're spoken to," he growled. The captive did not respond. Instead, he remained standing with the same calm stillness that had defined the entire group since the auction began. The traders stepped back down, visibly frustrated. The silence was beginning to feel like a wall that none of them could break through. Every command seemed to bounce off it and disappear. The auctioneer raised his voice again, trying to sound confident despite the growing tension. "These people are strong workers," he insisted to the buyers. "They've traveled far and they're tired, that's all. Give them a moment." But his explanation was no longer convincing. Buyers exchanged skeptical glances. Some of them began closing their ledgers slowly, as though preparing to leave if the situation did not improve. Others stepped farther away from the platform, signaling that their interest in the sale was fading. The traders noticed this shift immediately. A slave auction depended heavily on momentum. Once bidding began, excitement often pushed buyers to compete aggressively, sometimes driving prices far higher than expected. But without momentum, the marketplace could stall completely. And now, it was stalling. The captive's silence had done something no weapon or rebellion had accomplished in that moment. It had disrupted the psychology of the auction itself. The buyers no longer felt confident. Confidence was everything in a market driven by profit. Without it, even the most experienced traders struggled to close a sale. The auctioneer attempted another strategy. He turned away from the captives momentarily and addressed the crowd directly, his voice rising in an effort to reignite their interest. "Who'll start the bidding?" he called out. The question echoed across the square. No one answered. The buyers stood quietly, their expressions thoughtful rather than eager. A few men glanced at one another, silently waiting to see if someone else would take the risk of placing the first bid. But no one did. The silence on the platform had infected the entire marketplace. The traders began to feel a creeping sense of panic. Their profits depended entirely on the willingness of buyers to participate in the auction. If the investors walked away, the entire day's sale would collapse. One trader whispered anxiously to another, "This is bad." Another nodded grimly, "They're ruining the sale." Meanwhile, the captives remained perfectly still, their collective silence growing stronger with each passing minute. What had begun as a fragile plan whispered in the darkness had now become a powerful act of unity. Each person on the platform understood the same truth. If even one of them broke the silence, the illusion of resistance would shatter. But no one broke. Their quiet solidarity had transformed the auction block into something entirely different from what the traders had intended. Instead of a stage for humiliation and evaluation, it had become a stage for defiance. The buyers continued watching, uncertain how to interpret the situation. Some looked annoyed, others curious, and a few seemed almost uneasy at the sight of so many people standing together in silent resistance. The auctioneer finally lowered his voice, speaking through clenched teeth to the traders gathered nearby. "This cannot continue," he muttered. But the reality was already becoming clear. The marketplace had lost control of the platform, and the captives, armed with nothing more than silence, had discovered a weapon the system was never designed to confront, because the power of slavery relied not only on chains and whips, but on the expectation of obedience. And on that day, on that quiet morning in 1844, obedience had simply disappeared. The tension in the square had now grown so thick that it seemed to settle over the crowd like a heavy fog. What had begun as a routine morning auction had turned into something no one present had expected, and the longer the silence continued, the more obvious it became that the entire marketplace was slipping out of the traders' control. Buyers who had once stood close to the platform with eager expressions were now drifting backward, creating more distance between themselves and the unsettling stillness unfolding before them. Their ledgers remained closed, their coins untouched. For men accustomed to calculating profits with precision, uncertainty was the one thing they could not tolerate, and the captives on the platform had created nothing but uncertainty. The auctioneer stood rigidly at the center of the block, his earlier confidence now replaced by visible frustration. His voice had grown hoarse from repeated commands that had gone unanswered. Every attempt to restart the rhythm of the auction had failed. The familiar cadence of bids, once the heartbeat of the marketplace, had never even begun. Instead, the only sounds filling the square were whispers, nervous shuffling, and the occasional frustrated sigh from traders who could feel their profits slipping away. Below the platform, a group of plantation owners gathered together, speaking quietly but with clear skepticism. One of them, a tall man with a weathered face and a wide-brimmed hat, shook his head as he watched the captives standing silently on the block. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. Another buyer beside him closed his ledger slowly and slipped it back into his coat pocket. "Neither have I," he replied, "and I'm not paying good money for trouble." The remark carried farther than the speaker intended, drifting through the crowd and reinforcing the doubts already spreading among the buyers. Slave traders depended on maintaining the illusion that the captives they sold were obedient, dependable workers. But the scene unfolding on the platform was telling a very different story. Instead of compliance, the buyers were witnessing a unified refusal that raised uncomfortable questions. What if these captives refused to work once they reached a plantation? What if their silence today was only the beginning of larger acts of defiance? Investors did not gamble lightly with such risks. The traders sensed the shift in mood immediately. They began moving through the crowd, speaking urgently with potential buyers and attempting to reassure them that the situation was temporary. One trader approached a plantation owner who had been examining the captives earlier in the morning. "These people are strong laborers," he insisted in a low voice. "Just stubborn this morning. Once they're on a proper plantation, they'll fall in line." But the buyer did not appear convinced. "Stubborn laborers slow down the harvest," he replied bluntly, "and slow harvests cost money." Nearby, another buyer shook his head as he watched the silent figures on the platform. "A worker who won't speak when ordered isn't worth the risk." The traders' attempts to calm the buyers only seemed to deepen their skepticism. The logic of the marketplace was turning against the very men who had once controlled it. Every minute that passed without cooperation from the captives made the situation more difficult to salvage. The auctioneer tried once more to force momentum back into the sale. His voice rose again, though the confidence that once filled it had faded. "All right," he shouted toward the crowd. "Let's move things along. Who'll open the bidding?" The square remained quiet. No hand raised, no voice answered. The buyers stood with their arms folded or their hands resting on their belts, watching the platform with cautious expressions. The silence of the captives had now infected the entire marketplace. The usual excitement that accompanied an auction, shouted numbers, competitive bids, the thrill of securing a valuable purchase, had vanished completely. The auctioneer's eyes swept across the crowd, searching for any sign of interest. He pointed toward one of the captives, attempting to sound persuasive despite the growing tension. "Strong field hand," he declared loudly. "Young and healthy, who'll give me a starting bid?" Nothing. A breeze passed through the square, stirring dust along the ground and fluttering the edges of the auctioneer's coat. The quiet stretched longer than anyone expected. The traders exchanged anxious glances. This was no longer simply a slow auction. It was a collapse. One of the overseers stepped forward again and cracked his whip against the platform, perhaps hoping that a sudden display of authority would force the captives to react. The sharp sound echoed through the square, but the figures standing on the block did not move. Their stillness remained unbroken, their silence unwavering. For the buyers, the message was clear. These captives were not behaving like obedient property. They were behaving like people who had chosen defiance, and that perception alone was enough to frighten many potential investors. A plantation owner near the edge of the crowd turned away from the platform and began walking toward his horse. "I've seen enough," he said quietly to the man beside him. "There are other auctions." His departure did not go unnoticed. Several other buyers watched him leave and began reconsidering their own positions. If the sale could not proceed smoothly, there was little reason to remain. One by one, a few men began closing their ledgers. Coins returned to pockets, Boots turned slowly away from the platform. The traders noticed this immediately, and a wave of alarm spread among them. Losing one buyer was unfortunate. Losing several meant disaster. "Wait!" one trader called out, raising his voice in desperation. "The auction isn't finished yet." But his words carried little authority. The buyers were no longer convinced that the sale would happen at all. Another plantation owner shook his head as he stepped away from the crowd. "A market where the merchandise refuses orders isn't a market I trust." The statement drifted through the square, reinforcing the growing sense that the auction had failed before it even truly began. Meanwhile, the captives continued standing together on the platform, their quiet unity holding firm. None of them spoke, none of them moved. What had begun as a fragile act of resistance had now grown into something far more powerful. Their silence had done what threats, weapons, and punishments could not do in that moment. It had shaken the economic logic of the marketplace itself. Without demonstrations of obedience, the buyers could not measure the captives' value. Without measurable value, the buyers refused to invest. And without investment, the entire auction collapsed. The traders stood helplessly at the edges of the platform, watching their business unravel in real time. The auctioneer's voice had fallen silent. Even the overseers seemed uncertain how to proceed. Violence might force compliance eventually, but doing so in front of skeptical buyers risked confirming their worst fears, that the captives were difficult, rebellious, and dangerous investments. The marketplace had reached a standstill, and the captives, who had arrived in chains and under the watchful eyes of armed men, had discovered that unity could become a force stronger than anyone had anticipated. The square that morning had been built for commerce, but it had been transformed into something else entirely. A place where silence had dismantled the performance of power, a place where stillness had exposed the fragile dependence of an entire system on forced obedience. And as more buyers quietly drifted away from the platform, it became painfully clear to the traders that the day's auction, the one they had expected to bring profit and routine business, was slipping beyond their control. The market for human lives had been brought to a halt, not by violence, not by escape, but by a simple, unbreakable refusal to speak. As the crowd slowly thinned and the tension in the square began to dissolve into a strange, uneasy quiet, the reality of what had just happened settled over the marketplace like the fading echo of a storm. Only a short time earlier, the square had been alive with the confident energy of traders and investors expecting a profitable morning. Now, however, that energy had vanished. The buyers who had arrived with money in their pockets and calculations in their ledgers were leaving one by one, their footsteps carrying them away from a sale that had never truly begun. Some mounted their horses without another glance at the platform. Others walked away while speaking quietly among themselves, shaking their heads at the unsettling scene they had just witnessed. The auction block, once the center of commercial activity, stood strangely quiet in the middle of the square. The traders remained near the platform, their earlier confidence replaced by frustration and disbelief. For men accustomed to controlling every detail of the auction process, the failure of the sale felt almost incomprehensible. They had expected resistance at times, occasional hesitation, fear, perhaps even small acts of defiance, but nothing like the unified stillness they had encountered that morning. The captives had not shouted, protested, or fought. Instead, they had simply refused to participate in the ritual that allowed the marketplace to function. That refusal had created a ripple effect no one had anticipated. Without demonstrations of strength, buyers could not judge physical capability. Without answers to questions, buyers could not determine reliability. Without the appearance of obedience, buyers could not trust their investment. And without trust, the bids never came. The auctioneer finally stepped down from the platform, his boots striking the dirt with a heavy thud. The authority he had carried so confidently at the start of the day had drained away, leaving behind a man who looked deeply unsettled by what had just occurred. For years he had relied on his voice to control crowds and push buyers into competition. Yet on this morning, the loudest voice in the square had not been his. It had been the silence of the captives standing on the block. The overseers moved cautiously around the platform, their expressions tense as they watched the captives. Their whips still hung at their sides, but the moment for intimidation had passed. The buyers had already begun leaving, and any dramatic display of punishment now would serve little purpose. The marketplace had already been disrupted. Violence at this stage would only confirm what the buyers had begun to suspect, that the traders had lost control of the situation. The captives remained standing where they had been placed, their stillness unbroken even as the crowd around them thinned. The plan that had begun as a quiet whisper in the darkness of the holding enclosure had now unfolded in full daylight before an entire marketplace. None of them could know exactly what consequences might follow. Traders might attempt another sale later. Punishment might come once the crowd was gone. Yet in that moment, something remarkable had already happened. The auction had failed, and it had failed because the captives had acted together. The power of the act lay not in a single individual, but in the unity of the group. If even one person had spoken when commanded, the illusion of obedience would have returned, and the marketplace might have regained its rhythm. But no one had broken the silence. Each person's refusal had strengthened the resolve of the others, turning their stillness into a quiet shield that the traders could not easily penetrate. As the final buyers drifted away from the square, the traders gathered near the platform and spoke in low, urgent voices. Their frustration was clear. Some blamed the auctioneer for failing to control the situation. Others muttered about the captives themselves, calling them stubborn or troublesome. But beneath their anger lay a deeper concern that few of them were willing to admit aloud. The captives had exposed a weakness in the system. For generations, slave markets had operated under the assumption that obedience could always be forced. Chains, threats, and punishment were meant to guarantee compliance. Yet the events of that morning had revealed something unsettling. The system depended not only on force, but also on the participation of those being sold. Without demonstrations, without answers, without cooperation, the entire process became uncertain, and uncertainty was poison to a marketplace. The traders began discussing what to do next. Some suggested postponing the auction and trying again later, perhaps after isolating the captives or breaking their unity. Others worried that word of the incident might spread to nearby towns, making future buyers more cautious. Slave traders relied heavily on reputation. A market known for disorder or resistance could quickly lose the confidence of investors. While the traders argued among themselves, the captives stood quietly on the platform, their silence continuing even though the audience had largely disappeared. The square that had once buzzed with commercial excitement now felt almost empty. Dust drifted across the ground in the gentle breeze, and the wooden boards of the auction block creaked softly beneath the weight of those still standing there. In that quiet moment, the meaning of what had happened began to settle into history, not through written records or official reports, but through memory and whispered stories that would travel far beyond the boundaries of the town. Acts of resistance during slavery often took many forms. Some were loud and dramatic, such as rebellions or escapes. Others were quieter, but no less powerful. Small acts of defiance, refusing orders, slowing work, preserving culture and community, became ways for enslaved people to assert their humanity within a system designed to deny it. The silent auction of that morning belonged to this quieter tradition of resistance. It demonstrated that unity, even without weapons or violence, could disrupt the machinery of oppression in unexpected ways. For the traders, the event was a troubling reminder that the people they treated as property still possessed agency and will. For the buyers, it introduced doubt into a system that depended on the illusion of total control. And for the captives themselves, the moment proved something even more important, that collective action could shift the balance of power, even if only for a brief time. Stories of such moments often traveled quietly from plantation to plantation, carried through whispered conversations and shared experiences. A story like this one, where an entire auction had been halted by silence, would have lingered in the memories of those who witnessed it. It would have served as a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, unity could create cracks in systems that appeared unbreakable. The marketplace that morning had been designed to reduce human beings to numbers and prices, but the captives had refused to play that role. Instead of demonstrating their value to buyers, they had demonstrated their solidarity with one another. Instead of performing obedience, they had shown stillness. And in doing so, they had transformed a place of commerce into a moment of quiet rebellion. History does not always record such events in official documents. Many acts of resistance during slavery were deliberately ignored or minimized by those who controlled the written record. Yet the impact of those acts lived on in stories passed through generations. Reminders that the fight for dignity and freedom did not always take the form of open battle. Sometimes it appeared in the simple act of standing together, sometimes it appeared in the refusal to speak, and sometimes, as in the silent auction of 1844, that refusal became powerful enough to stop an entire marketplace in its tracks. Stories like this reveal the strength of collective resistance and the ways ordinary people found courage in the most difficult circumstances. If you found this story powerful and thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss our next historical documentary, and leave a comment telling us how interesting you found this story and where you're watching from. Because history is full of moments like this, moments that remind us that even in the darkest chapters of the past, the human spirit continued to resist, endure, and demand justice. And here on the Black Timeline, we will keep bringing those forgotten stories back into the light.